Jeffrey Schnapp, who is the founder of MetaLab at Harvard, a research unit dedicated to innovation and experimentation in the arts, media, and humanities, hosted at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. He's the author of numerous books, and he's recently curated the exhibition Speed Limits at the CCA. He's also the author of a forthcoming book called The Electric Information Age Book, which is coming out next week and is hotly anticipated. After Jeffrey, Beatriz Colomina will present. She is the director of the Graduate Studies PhD program and the program in Media and Modernity at Princeton University. Her books include Privacy and Publicity, Modern Architecture as Mass Media, Sexuality in Space, Domesticity at War, and Clipstamp Fold, The Radical Architecture of Little Magazines, 1960X to 1970X. Those two presentations will be here at the podium. Peter Eisenman will present from the table. Peter Eisenman is the principal of Eisenman Architects and a professor at Yale School of Architecture. His books include Eisenman Inside Out, Selected Writings 1963 to 1988, and 10 Canonical Buildings, 1950 to 2000. So please help me welcome our first speaker, Jeffrey Schnapp. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. If we could drop the lights down a little bit, that'd be great. Some of the presentation I'm going to make today, which is going to be a more informal presentation than some of the ones from the first panel, is going to, I hope, intersect with a couple of the points that came up, particularly in the roundtable discussion at the end of last session. Most manifestos fail, and that was true already in the 19th century, and certainly true of the bulk of the manifestos published before World War II. More manifestos, as I hope to show you, are being written than ever. The genre is thriving, and therefore many more manifestos are failing than ever in the entire history of the manifesto as a genre. So the question that I'm interested in addressing here really is the question of what is the space of performance that makes manifestos matter, and what is the place of news from the future or the future present, as manifestos sometimes have been described, and there was a very lively discussion in the last session about this very question. What is the place of news from the present future in a world defined by 24-hour news cycles, in a world where there is a hypersaturation of forms of information, polemic, opinion, and so forth? And by the way, this problem of how to make a manifesto perform, to fulfill its performative vocation, is one that Marinetti was acutely conscious of. As some of you will know, the founding manifesto of futurism was published in late February of 1909, not because it was written, despite its own rhetoric, in February of 1909. It was written 3 to 4 months before. But Marinetti knew that the only theater that would perform the public function, that would put into effect the public claims that the document makes, that its entire rhetoric is crafted around, was the front page of a daily newspaper. That is, in a sense, the true message of the manifesto, is the way in which it stages itself within that very place. And therefore, he was willing to wait months and months in order to occupy that position, a position where his predecessors were figures like Émile Zola and authors of other documents that were, in almost every other case, political manifestos, not literary or artistic manifestos. Now, I borrowed my title here from a phrase which was widely used in two quite different environments, but they're environments that can serve as bookends, in a sense, for the larger argument that, for purposes really of discussion, of conversation, I want to present here. The first is the use of the term manifest files to describe the files that compose an inventory, the listing, like in the sense of the cargo manifest, the listing of the contents of a ship. And those contents, as some of you may even recall from port practices that have carried over to this day, were posted in a visible public place. The notion of the manifest and the manifesto itself as a genre is closely coupled to the idea of public space, some kind of concept of public space. The second is the dominant usage, if you Google manifest files as a phrase today, which is deep inside the non-moving machinery of this very device here, namely the files that are within an archive on a Java platform that ensure the performance of a series of instructions. Now, I'd like to sort of use the gap between these two uses of the concept of the manifest to try to pose a fundamental series of questions about what kind of language can a manifesto speak today, not to mention an architectural manifesto, precisely at the center of the question of what is public space today. I think the crisis of public space, or rather the increasing hybridity of forms of public space, raises an interesting question about the prospects for a genre like the manifesto, not to mention the architectural manifesto, to succeed. So this talk is really an attempt to really think through that issue in the broadest possible sense. And to throw at this question, I have a series of slides of different data mining tools. I thought it would be interesting to look at, first of all, to verify the hypothesis that the architectural manifesto has indeed declined and disappeared, that this is not just a kind of impression that we have. And second of all, to see what environment it has disappeared in other words, to what degree its disappearance is anomalous or continuous with other sets of phenomena. Now, Google Ngrams are hardly an oracle. It's a very crude tool, but it's quite an interesting tool if you like to be able to read, as I do, millions of books at the mere click of my mouse. And as you can see, manifestos have been thriving. There have been peaks and bumps along the road. In the 1820s, there's an interesting little blip right there in anticipation of Marx and Engels. But it's been a rising curve all the way through. The statistics beyond the year 2000 are pretty much unreliable because of all kinds of restrictions on access to data. But this is in a corpus of several million books. And you can see that the manifesto books, print objects that call themselves manifestos, have been expanding very consistently through into the 1970s and early 1980s even, and then seem to level off to some degree or other. Now, the topic of manifestos is one that I bring interest to not only as a scholar, as a historian of the avant-gardes, but also because I've been a co-author of several manifestos. This happens to be one of them. It was actually a joke. Like many manifestos, it was born out of the sense I was teaching the Mellon seminar in the digital humanities at UCLA, and it was a seminar in which people were participating through the live broadcasting of the seminar in Second Life all over the world. And we thought it would be interesting not only to preach new models of collaboration, but to do a kind of experiment in massively collaborative authoring. And so we decided, given the fact that the year was 2008 and the centenary of the publication of the Founding Manifesto of Futurism was right around the corner, that it would be interesting to try and experiment using digital tools with massively collaboratively authoring a document. So Todd Presner and I, who's my collaborator at UCLA, we decided to draft. I actually drafted the first version on the airplane down from San Francisco to Los Angeles, so it was really quickly written and rather scrappily written. A manifesto that had, as you can see, it borrowed freely from Apollinaire's Anti-Tradition Futuriste, and right at the center of it was the roses for the open source movement and so on, and then merde, the great diminishers, the traffickers in intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. That was this piece was in the 1.0 version of the draft manifesto. Then hundreds of other people wrote, added, took away, collaborated in a comment press site, and eventually the 2.0 version of the manifesto came out, but not before I discovered something that Marinetti discovered when he published the Founding Manifesto of Futurism, was that if you're doing a good job writing a manifesto, the friction begins early. In our case, many of the readers of the WordPress site of the 1.0 version of the manifesto, particularly academics whose skills were presumably, at least in the area of literary interpretation, seemed actually strangely averse to accepting the notion of the manifesto or the genre conventions of the manifesto in their own field. It was fine as long as a manifesto belonged out in history. But the minute it was a manifesto concerned with trying to reshape notions of what scholarly production or knowledge was, they didn't like it a lot. So we ended up actually having to add a preface. And in the area of prefaces, I just wanted to remind you that when Marinetti did finally achieve his goal, after months of patience and lobbying, I might add, his manifesto did not appear as he would have desired it, but rather it had a little preface by Calmette, Gustave Calmette, the editor of Le Figaro, in which Calmette tries, I think as you can see from this, the tone of this, the very serene and quite secure, reassuring tone of this preface, is reinserted into genre confines that are not that of the manifesto, that say that the Futurist Manifesto is really just another document from these noisy literary artistic schools. Yes, Mr. Marinetti is a feverish young poet, but don't take his words, his fiery polemical words too seriously. There's an attempt, in other words, to kind of naturalize and domesticate a certain polemical rhetoric. So in that same spirit, my collaborators and I actually we drafted a manifesto, a kind of meta-manifesto, to explain to our literary colleagues actually what a manifesto is, which is, as Tony Vidler anticipated in his opening remarks, based on the notion of the hand, of a hand that waves forward, that fends off, that's engaged in gestures of an economic and polemical sort, which is to say that the manifesto at its core is a deeply rhetorical genre, a genre that depends upon a very highly codified set of tricks which were formulated in the course of its history going back to the 17th century, and whose classic moments are the Communist Manifesto and the early manifestos of the avant-gardes. Now, as to the question of has the Architectural Manifesto died, or what did happen to the Architectural Manifesto? Well, here's another data mining tool, and indeed, it does appear that the Architectural Manifesto, if you look at architecture here, this is about a survey of about 1 million books between the dates of what's our start date, 1907 and the year 2000. The fate of the manifesto, of the label manifesto, has fluctuated over time, but while there has been a very clear, at least expressions of very clear reprise of manifestos in the fine arts fields, right here, this is that green line, what is that, circa starting in, I can't remember, roughly around 1992. We do see this rather precipitous decline on the part of architectural manifestos. Now, whether this is real or not, true or not, it's what appears in these sorts of data mining tools. So there does seem to be a problem, a crisis, if you like, that regards specifically architecture, architectural discourse that's framed within the genre rhetorical constraints of the Architectural Manifesto. Now, I thought it might be interesting, since these are two collections. Anthologies are, of course, always selective readings. And I would very much agree with the point that Tony Vidler made in his remarks, that I'm not even sure that the Jenks, contrary to its pretenses, really contains almost any manifestos. Yet it remains precisely by the kinds of acts of inclusion, by the anthologizing techniques that Jenks performs, it remains a work that I think is, at the very least, we can consider symptomatic. In other words, useful as a basis for thinking about what has happened to the Architectural Manifesto. So what are the timeframes of these two books? I'm going to run some data mining tools on them and show you what the outcome is. Hopefully the outcomes will be visible to you, maybe more visible than they'll be to me. Well, as all of you, I suspect, know, in the case of the Conrad's book, we begin with van der Velde's program from 1903. We go through a series of the core manifestos associated particularly with the circle around the Bauhaus. In the case of the Jenks crop, we have instead a series of thematic units that are not strictly, they're chronologically organized, but they're clustered around different themes. So there's a kind of resistance to chronology But that chronology begins around 1955, well into the World War II, post-World War II period, and it extends to close to the time of the publication of the work itself, 1994, 1997, I think might be the latest one that's included. So these are two different framings of two different moments in the history of what two editors, two anthologists consider to be theoretical or programmatic statements related to manifestos or in manifesto form in the field of architecture. The closing document in Conrad's is this document from the Heimat deiner Hause show in Stuttgart, which is a really classic iteration of the manifesto in its most elementary, polemical, almost legislative form. And in the case of Jenks, we have Hamilton's cartoon about the sort of supporting column of, in a sense, post-manifesto architecture. It's a kind of manifesto about manifestos that leads us from less is more to less is a bore to I am a whore, and I presume beyond to I am no more, perhaps, according to the current state of the manifesto, or at least such the data mining tools would suggest. Now I'm going to come back to these questions. In many ways, what I'll be saying will touch upon some themes that have already been, I think, interestingly evoked in the prior talks, but simply to try to understand what the preconditions are for manifesto genres to thrive and to be effective forms of communication. And hovering around the larger question I want to ask about the fate of architectural manifestos is how, if it is true that architectural manifestos are in a state of decline or disappearance, where are manifestos not in a state of decline? Or how has the field, if you like, been reshaped in ways that might have relocated or shifted the borderlines of architectural polemic? I will leave that as an open question, but I want to look at some examples here. Now, the first of the examples, now this is a visualization, a comparative visualization of Conrad's versus Jenks's vision of architectural discourse. And this is a cloud-based tool, and I'm not sure how legible it's going to be, so I'm going to take you to, whoops, I'm sorry, that's supposed to go forward here. Okay, so what you're looking at is this is a comparison of the kind of network analysis of the semantic fields that each of the works constructs. The column in the center are terms defined by their centrality, by their quantitative overlap. So architecture, as you would well imagine, is the anchor term. And on the left, on your left, you have the terms from the Conrad's anthology, stretching, in other words, through the 60s. These are all terms that occur repeatedly and that are networked with some of these center terms. And on the right side, you see from Jenks, these are all words that do not that appear also in relationship to these shared words, but that do not appear in Conrad's. So it's a contrastive set of tables that shows the relative priority of each. Now, hopefully, this is going to be visible to you as we go forward. Whoops, I'm sorry. That was... All right, let's see. See if these video clips will run. Okay. So here we're just looking at, okay, so if we click on architecture, those are the full lengths of the books, and we can see the network of terms that are lit up by the word architecture. In other words, where the word architecture, what are the networks of associations between these different words and, for instance, the concept of building? What does building mean? What does the city bear as freight? And I'm not going to walk you through all the details here, but I think one of the things that you'll see is that the network of connections is a much looser, much less integrated network when we look at the Jenks side of the picture vis-a-vis the Conrad's side, despite the fact that Conrad's has many, many more texts, a greater heterogeneity, you might think, of forms of discourse within it. I'm going to visualize these in another form, so I'm not going to linger over the details of how these networks actually work. And I was hoping to do a live demonstration, but the site that allows you to do these is down right now. So for instance, the engineer. The word engineer appears only marginally in Jenks. It doesn't make it into the top 50 terms. And there's a series of figures, similarly like standardization and prefabrication don't make it into the top 50 terms in Jenks, whereas they're right in the hierarchy of terms that are privileged in the Conrad's anthology. So let me just show you a couple of other visualizations that raise similar, that give us at least a, some of these are aspects of the shift that's taking place that I think are quite visible, quite accessible to any critically attuned reader, but I think these tools of visualization can be useful for gaining an understanding of them. In the case of Conrad's, you see here, this is a search of adjacency. In other words, what words is architecture most closely associated with and to what degree? So this is essentially a map of the relations between the term architecture and the kind of freight that it carries with respect to, for instance, the notion of modernity, with respect to urbanism, with respect to the other arts, architecture's place within the arts, with respect to social forms. Now, if we look at, this is just a redacted version of that screenshot. You can see some of those features. If we look instead, let's look at Jenks for a second at the very same question. In other words, how is architecture coupled to this broad network of other features of society and the arts? I think the first thing you notice is there's a lot more flotsam and jetsam, or like a sense of disaggregation, if you like, of threads within the world of discourse around architecture, and this point is confirmed if we go to the, you can see there are fragments of this discussion that no longer have as tight connections. There are other connections that have emerged, on the other hand, that seem much more dominant. For instance, the linking between architecture and the theme of the city, which was only one of the features of the word cluster around architecture in Conrad's, where there's a clear alternation between notions of rural modernization and urban modernization, whereas here architecture seems to have a privileged relationship to urban space, and the country is way out there in the periphery of the network. Here we're looking at a different aspect of these features. So what architecture and what? In other words, what additive sorts of collocations take place in the course of, by dint of the anthologizing that Conrad's performs? And this is just looking at the top 50 terms again. And you see in the case of the Conrad's anthology, which is taking us from the turn of the century, of the 20th century to the 60s, architecture's closest links, we have on the one hand a line running to the realm of the economy, practical knowledge, the applicative dimensions of science, another heading towards the realm of materials, industry, construction, and form, and a third stretching to a whole cluster of elements that bring together art and science. So let's look at the Jenks one. And again, I realize this is somewhat of an academic exercise, but I think it helps just to sort of illustrate some of the larger dynamics that might have conditioned the decline of the manifesto as a form of construction. Look at how completely disaggregated the constructions are with respect to the role of architecture. Architecture is even disaggregated from space. So I want to come back now to the real question, which is really the question of if a genre like the manifesto is to play a central role in forms of argumentation, about argumentation that somehow position architecture at the center of a larger set of social concerns, how might such a genre fulfill the needs of the present? What kind of language should it speak? How could we answer the kinds of questions that a classic iteration of the manifesto genre, that we like, the one that we find from the Heimat show in Stuttgart, who demands what, why, for whom, from whom, how? What are the sorts of expectations or preconditions required for a manifesto-type discourse? And the answer, I'm just going to anticipate that the question, actually, really, it's a question or a problem I'm going to put on the table, is that there's a lot of architectural manifestos that use the word architecture in exactly this form. So what happens in a world where architecture itself has become so metaphorized and so associated with forms of architecture that are no longer architecture as we understand it as a spatial, a physical practice? Now, we've already seen this slide before, and we noted the ways in which we have a kind of explosion of manifesto production in the fine arts domain and an apparent decline in the architectural domain. There's other correlations we could see also between, this is before we were looking at the whole production of print artifacts. Now we're looking at different terms within these corpora, and you can see that architecture used with manifesto is relatively flat here, but we do see that World Wide Web, technology, digital, those terms seem to be rising. Their coupling to the word manifesto seems to be particularly tight, and we see what appears to be a shifting of the field, which, as I've already anticipated, I think has something to do with shifting ideas about public space, about the nature of that public space in which manifestos can effectively speak. Now, they're really, if the golden era is what Conrad's anthologizes, let's assume that it's that it's the point of reference, that when we say architectural manifesto, we tend to mean those manifestos that fall within, even though I would underscore, as I think somebody else already pointed out, even within Conrad's, there's many texts that are not manifestos. So just like Jenks, there's a certain amount of a sleight of hand in bringing these forms of discourse that are programmatic but not quite manifesto-like into the fold. And that raises a larger question about just how deeply nested, how fundamental manifesto discourse is or has been to architecture as a whole. In any case, I think there are two dominant models. One we've already looked at in the case of the We Demand. The other, I think, which is a beautiful example, is from the Distill Manifesto, with its use of apodictic, lapidary statements of fact, where there is no we or I who speaks, who philosophizes with a hammer. And these are two genres that I want to begin to conclude these brief remarks with, that raise a larger question, which, and I haven't shown you any of the visualizations of this, but I think it's in what is going to be a dialectical conclusion to this talk, raises the question about the sort of performing subject that has been central to the manifesto as a genre right from its beginning. And there's really two dominant models. The anchorage, the plausible collective, the we that speaks in Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto, in the Sant'Elia Manifesto, for instance, is of course a we that is in the future. It's a hypothetical collectivity. It's a choral voice that the manifesto itself will bring about by conjuring up an audience, in a sense, of those who will adhere to the precepts that are being advanced and make them their own, and also those who will rebel and reject, and therefore create the clash that the manifesto is itself the catalyst for. There's the second mode that we saw in the case of the Distill Manifesto is this apodictic recitation of facts, this sort of transcendental we that's implicit, never explicit, but I think it performs exactly the same conjuring act of a kind of future collectivity, a future community of belief. Now, one of the things that's really striking in the Jenks anthology is, in fact, the attenuation of the we. There's much less declarative, there are less declarative claims, as you might expect, because of the heterogeneous nature of the materials from which the texts are culled. And I wonder, and these are all in the wonder category, but whether there hasn't been a strengthening of sub-communities within the architectural field and the opening up of more and more crossover fields. In other words, a weakening of this sense of what the we is in the field of architecture. And particularly as the meshing between architecture and media forms are created. And therefore, the drift of architectural manifestos out of that fold would, I think, be a plausible outcome. The second question that's always been fundamental to manifestos is audience. How do you create a plausible present or future readership that functions either as the mirror image of the subject of the utterance or its antagonist? And again, this question of how architecture itself has become a kind of ubiquitous, a sort of a figure within discourse about information and data, the digital architecture realm, I think raises some interesting questions about how that audience might be or might not be constituted. The third point I want to touch upon is simply that of rhetoric. This is already mentioned in several earlier presentations. Manifestos are, of course, characterized by their ability to adopt certain kind of, whether it's an explicitly prophetic stance or a stance that's based on an insistence upon urgency, crisis, decision, contradiction, decision even in the kind of almost legislative, juridical sense. They involve rhetorics of lawmaking, legislating with a hammer, so to speak, inventorying of a kind of furious and feverish sort, the use of aphorism and slogan over and against treatise and exposition and so forth. And they always have included from the very beginning a kind of cut and paste technology. Every manifesto was constantly recycled and represented in other media. So in many ways, you would think that we would be living in the golden era of the manifesto as we speak today, with a kind of multi-channeling possibilities of different kinds of digital media. But that raises the question of what it would mean if it is true that architectural manifestos are in a kind of crisis or nosedive or whatever, or that architectural manifestos have moved somewhere else within the world of manifesto production. And this was already touched upon in Craig's opening prefatory remarks, but our abiding skepticism about establishing forms of counterpower in the age of digital networks, certainly is an abiding feature of a certain resistance to manifesto-type discourse, the decline in the social prestige of law and legal fictions, the pervasiveness of certain media rhetorics of crisis and conflict that are already normative in a sense, and therefore against which we form our discussions, our debates within our own professional circles. The emergence of a kind of cut and paste universal vernacular within digital culture and so forth. My key point here, and I'm coming to a close, is the problem of the space of delivery. Manifestos perform, but they perform in some kind of public locus of posting, of a public locus of performance and reception, where there are rules, typically, whether they're broken or they're respected. And it's that very public location that supports a public claim. So on the one hand, it's clear from some of the visualizations that I showed you at the beginning that we have this tremendous proliferation of manifesto-like documents, but we seem to have an increasing decrease in audiences for those objects. And therefore, the whole question of how the migration of the nature of the public space that exists in our time, the possibility for forms of critical discourse to reach audiences in bono or in malo, for embrace or critique or clash, I think is a key issue. And within this is, of course, the possibility that there's an attenuation of the sense of architecture's unique role in building and shaping public spaces that might be somehow inflecting this decline of the genre. We've, in Tony Vidler's introduction, he talked a little bit about some of the discursive models that have shaped manifesto practices. These are all genres that have a rhetoric, as I said before, of urgency. And in a contemporary culture where hype, is such a central feature, where we have a constant drumbeat of news, information, accident, and so forth. And at the same time, we have forms of public legal discourse that move into increasingly invisible spaces. And with mediators and aggregators and search platforms and so forth assuming a kind of central intermediate role, the question of what kind of language a manifesto could speak and be heard, I think, is a deep question. And finally, the question of atmospherics, of whether there's not a partial tonal mismatch or parcel match between facets of the architectural present, or more broadly, the cultural present, and the manifesto as a genre. This was touched upon in the discussion. A certain kind of preference for irony, for coolness, for aloofness on the part of those of us who are engaged in a critique of certain forms of institutional practice and knowledge. The seductions of the meta, the theoretical, over this form of hortatory prophetic discourse. Where does this leave us? Somewhere, I think, in the cloud. Maybe a new golden era, maybe a moment of kind of hyper-proliferation of the manifesto with manifestos that are all about the I and that never reach an audience made up of we's. Thank you.
Jeffrey, you want your computer?
It's on the inside, okay.
Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you. No, I prefer to see. All right, so thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion on what happened to the manifesto. Here are some points. The manifesto, and some of them have already appeared today. The manifesto is media. It does not exist outside other media. That is newspaper, magazine, pamphlets, posters, radio, etc. It has to be made public. I mean, of course, you can scream it in a square, as I imagine it was done before the age of the printed media. The golden age of the manifesto is, of course, print. Design is part of the architectural manifesto. It's not just the design of the manifesto itself that I'm talking about, the graphics and the layout, which are, of course, important. But what I'm trying to say is that an architectural project can be an integral part of a manifesto, part of the argument, not an illustration. The third one is that manifesto always precedes the work. It is a blueprint of the future. Fourth, every manifesto reworks other manifestos, as Jeffrey had already said here, recycles other manifestos. And fifth, new media equals new manifestos, but they may not look like manifestos anymore. Of course, the history of the avant-garde in art, in architecture, in literature cannot be separated from the history of its engagement with the media. And it's not just that the avant-garde uses the media to publicize their work. They use it, of course, but that's not the point. The point is that the work did not exist before its publication. And this, of course, has been already made very clear today, with many people referring to the Futurist manifesto. Futurismo did not really exist at all before the publication of this manifesto. Not even the group existed until it was published in the front page of this most revered newspaper in Europe, very deliberately. If this had been published in a small newspaper in Italy, it would never have had any effect, right? It was, of course, a stroke of advertising genius. Even members of the Futurist group were recruited through the manifesto. So anybody from Boccioni to Carrà to Balla to Severini, etc., were not in the group. The group did not exist, right? Likewise, you can say, and here is Marinetti with Futurismo practically coming out of his head, the manifesto of Futurismo. Anyway, Adolf Loos did not exist at all before his polemic writings in the pages of newspapers and in his own little magazine, Das Andere. As Banham already wrote in Theories and Design, when Loos arrived in Paris, he was already famous, but his fame was due to his writings rather than to his buildings, which seem to have been known only by hearsay. I love this idea that you will know about buildings by hearsay. But of course, the important thing here to understand is that Loos arrived in Paris, accused of pederastia, by the way, in 1922, and he was still known for only for the writings that he had done in the turn of the century, basically, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and many of which operated like manifesto, and of course had attracted the Dadaists. Likewise, Le Corbusier did not exist before L'Esprit Nouveau, published between 1920 and 1925, and the many books that came out of this magazine. He became known as an architect and created even a clientele for his practice through these polemical pages. What is interesting about Le Corbusier is not even his name existed. His name was a pseudonym invented or used for writing about architecture in the pages of L'Esprit Nouveau. And in that sense, you can say that Le Corbusier was an effect of L'Esprit Nouveau, an effect of a manifesto, of a set of manifestos. Even an architect like Mies van der Rohe, who is primarily thought of in terms of craft, tectonics, and these things, and not as a writer, didn't really exist without G, the journal that he was part of, and the many little magazines that he contributed, anything from Frühlicht to Mirth, etc. Even entire groups from Surrealismo to the Style to Archigram became an effect of their manifesto-like journals. I like very much, and some people here may have heard me tell this story that I love of Rainer Banham, who is living in London across the street from Peter Cook, and one day he's walking the dog or whatever, and then there is a limo with Japanese architects that they stand on the street and get out of the limo and ask him where is the office of Archigram. And of course, Banham is completely perplexed because Archigram does not exist. Archigram is a little leaflet that is being produced in the kitchen of Peter Cook's that lives across the street from him. And only later, only in retrospective, this heterogeneous group of architects decided to capitalize on this fame acquired by the magazine called the Archigram. Archigram, by the way, as in telegram, architecture, and communication system. During the 60s and 70s, of course, there was an explosion of architectural little magazines which instigated radical transformation in architectural culture and generated many manifestos, as many people already from Felicity Scott to Craig had already talked about today, but I'm not going to talk about it. What I'm interested in is in this Rainer Banham reaction to this moment. He practically cannot contain his excitement in an article entitled Thun Wave Hits Architecture of 1966. He basically throws away any kind of scholarly restraint to absorb the syncopated rhythms of the new magazines in a kind of futuristic ecstasy when he writes, one thumb rave, and it is not ready, steady, go, even if it sometimes looks like it. The sound effects are produced by the erupting of underground architectural protest magazines. Architecture, state queen, mother of the art, is no longer courted by plush glosses and cool scientific journals alone, but is having her skirts blown up and her bodies unzipped by irregular newcomers, which are typically rhetorical, with it moralistic, misspelled, improvisatory, anti-smooth, funny format, cliquey, art-oriented but stoned out of their minds with science fiction images of an alternative architecture that will be perfectly possible tomorrow if only the universe, and especially the law of gravity, were differently organized. 1966. And this, I think, is a kind of historian manifesto, something that we can say that we have lost too. So we keep talking about how we have lost the architect's manifesto, but we also have lost the capacity as historians and as theorists to react to what is in front of us with the freshness of, in many senses, of Banham. In the meantime, another kind of manifesto, but of course this is a reference to the Thun room, whatever, so it's clear reference to the for Banham, who was of course recovering also the futurist for history. But in the meantime, and at the same time that there is this eruption of little magazines, a new kind of manifesto emerged, which we have already talked about, in the form of books. Robert Venturi's self-proclaimed manifesto, Complexity and Contradiction, declared a gentle manifesto by himself. And also you can argue, of course, Robert Venturi did not exist before Complexity and Contradiction. And likewise, Rem Koolhaas, Delirious New York, self-declared retroactive manifesto, and you could also argue that Rem Koolhaas did not exist before Delirious New York. In fact, it will take him a long time to catch up with himself. So, and to insist, it is not that we learn about the work of these architects through the publications. The manifesto precedes the work. Mies actually is a case in point, and I like to talk about Mies because nobody thinks about Mies in those terms. But in fact, his place in architectural history, his role as one of the leaders of the modern movement, was established through a series of 5 projects, none of them actually built or even buildable. They were not developed at that level. He didn't know how to develop at that level, even if he had given the opportunity, that he produced for competitions and publications during the first half of the 20s. And I'm talking, of course, about the Friedrichstrasse skyscraper of 1921, the glass skyscraper of 1922, the reinforced concrete office building of 1923, and the concrete and brick country houses of 1923 and 1924. Mies first, all of them, of course, produced for publications and exhibitions. Mies' first writings were also produced in relation to this project. His first article, a skyscraper, was published in Frühlicht in 1922. Office building, or Bureau House office building was published in G, in the first issue of G, alongside the concrete office building. You have the first really manifesto of Mies, and likewise the concrete country house appear framing, or the other way around. His article Bauen, or his manifesto Bauen, appears framing the concrete country house in 1923. In total, I will just show you these 3, but in total Mies wrote 7 articles in those years, contributing significantly to the making of his persona. It's also during these years that he changed his name from Mies to Mies van der Rohe, but I will not go into that. Let me zoom into these articles because they clearly take the form of a manifesto. Literally, Mies makes a series of start declarations which take the form almost of a poem, as you can see on the top on the left, and the image of the project is given exactly the same space as the poem, placed side by side. And then sitting on top of this bold label, Bureau House, let me put it in English so you can also read what he's actually saying, with a gradually more technical statement or description underneath. But what is important here is that the statement and project are inseparable. The project is seen to make a statement, and the statement is seen as a kind of project. The image of the project is not an illustration of the statement, it is part of the statement itself. In G, number 2, Mies repeats the same strategy, again insisting on the equivalent of a statement and project, and again dividing the text between a series of declarations and a more detailed description under the image, each sign, by the way, with the project between them occupying the same amount of space. It's kind of curious that he signs twice, here and then down here, and this is the text that some historians say that he wrote with Hans Richter, so maybe that's why he has to sign it twice. Anyway, it was these 5 projects, these 5 paper architecture, if you want, together with the publicity apparatus enveloping them, that first made Mies into a historical figure. The houses that he had built so far and that he continued to develop during the same years would have taken him nowhere. It is true that these are the houses. The real house of 907 was noted by a critic and published in Modern Bauformer and in Decoration. But between the somehow modest articles covering this house in 910 And his own article in Fröhlich in 1922, listen to this is when he's presenting the class Skyscraper, nothing of Mies was published. 12 years of absolute silence. I mean, historians are always very, they try to dissimulate this fact. I'm sure that has to be extremely traumatic for Mies, who was, of course, a very ambitious person, and I don't have anything against ambition. I think it's good to have ambition. So can you imagine the trauma? And it's only in Fröhlich, which is a self-published article, right? Here. So, of course, we could attribute the silence of the critics to somehow to the blindness of these architectural critics, as some historians today seem to imply. But I think Mies' attitude in that regard, it makes much more sense. In the mid-1920s, he destroyed the drawings of most of his work prior to that time, thereby constructing a very precise image of himself, one from which all incoherences were erased. Not, of course, the parallelism with Loos, who destroyed all the documents of his projects when he left Vienna from Paris in 1922, and with Le Corbusier, who excluded all his early work from publication in his complete works. A manifesto requires destruction of history, even destruction of one's own history. Still in 1947, at the time that Philip Johnson was organizing the exhibition of Mies at the Museum of Modern Art, and he was also organizing this publication, the catalog, which will be the first really important book of Mies, the first book on Mies, and the first retrospective exhibition of Mies' work at MoMA. Apparently, Johnson was unable to convince Mies to include some of the early work in the exhibition of the book. Not enough of an statement, Mies is supposed to have said. Not enough of a manifesto. Mies excluded from the exhibition in the end all his traditional work up to 1924, with the exception which finally he gave in and accepted that the Kroller-Müller house will be included. But here you can see in the plan of the exhibition, which is so interesting actually, it's like a project of Mies, right? What he considers his manifestos, right? Mies' work, I think, is really a textbook of a wider phenomena. Modern architecture became modern, not as is usually understood by using glass, steel, or reinforced concrete. That has nothing to do, but engaging with the media, with publications, competitions, and exhibitions. That is, the materials of communication were used to rebuild the house. And with Mies, this is literally the case. What has been a series of rather conservative domestic projects realized for real clients. The Real House, the Pearl House, the Kroller-Müller House, the Werner House, the Urbi House became, in the context of the Berlin art exhibition of G, of Fröhlich, etc., of Merth, a series of manifestos of modern architecture. Not only that, but in Mies you can see, perhaps like in no other architect of the modern movement, a true case of schizophrenia between his published project and those developed for his clients. Still in the mid-1920s, at the same time that he was developing his most radical projects, Mies could build such conservative houses as what you see here in the screen, Villa Eichstätt, in a suburb of Berlin, 1923, and the Villa Mosler in Potsdam, even more scary, 1924. That is, that for a long time there was an enormous gap between the flowing architecture of Mies' published project and his struggle to find the appropriate techniques to produce the same effects in built form. That is, for many years he was literally trying to catch up with his publications, with his manifestos. Perhaps that's why he worked so much, so hard to perfect a sense of realism in the representation of his projects, as for example in the photomontage of the glass skyscraper with cars flying down the Friedrichstrasse, almost like in a Lacan mirror stage. I know I cannot do it, but one day I will do it, right? So it's like projecting things out. It is not by chance that Mies started to catch up himself precisely in the context of one-to-one structures built for temporary exhibitions. The Weissenhof-Siedlung in Stuttgart, where Mies finally was managed to use a steel structure and put up non-load bearing walls in his apartment building, and of course the Barcelona pavilion of 1929. When commissioned to do this famous building, the German Barcelona pavilion, for the international exhibition in Barcelona, Mies asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs what was to be exhibited. That is, of course, a normal question for an architect. What is this building for? An artist doesn't need to ask that at all, right? But the answer is what is interesting. Nothing will be exhibited, he was told. The pavilion itself will be exhibited. So it was like if Mies was being treated as an artist, right? If Mataclar say that the difference between art and architecture is that one has plumbing and the other one doesn't, then the pavilion is art. In any case, it was precisely in the absence of a traditional client or program that Mies was able to take his work to a new limit, and one of the most influential buildings of the 20th century emerged, and I will say as a pure manifesto. Mies, which raises the question, of course, of whether the pavilion itself, all pavilions, are a kind of manifesto, or many pavilions, because architects, in fact, treat exhibitions like magazines as the site for polemical statements about the future, precisely. And the history of manifestos is inseparable from the history of these experimental pavilions. Anywhere, this is from Bruno Tau Glass House to l'Esprit Nouveau Pavilion to the Breda Pavilion. Probably some people here may think that this is Ben van Berkel or something, but it's Baldassarre in 1952 in the Milan Fair. Fray Otto Pepsi Pavilion. Fray Otto here. Before was what? The Philips Pavilion. Fray Otto, the Pepsi Pavilion, the Teatrino del Mondo, and Diller and Escofidio Renflor Blar building of the beginning of this century. It is important to know that I think this is a tradition of manifesto through design, by the way, but it's also important to know that manifestos, as Jeffrey already said before, tend to refer to early manifestos. This we have already seen here, obviously. Each is a reworking of an earlier statement. Mies' polemical pavilion in Barcelona was in fact revisited in the 1985 Milan Triennale, when OMA constructed its body building house, a Barcelona pavilion bent to fit the curve of the allotted site which has been given to them in the exhibition building. Koolhaas wrote, "By then, phobic about the duty to reveal, we decided to embody our resistance in an exhibit about exhibition. At the time, a clone of Mies' pavilion was being built in Barcelona. How fundamentally it differed from Disney." So this project, of course, is a reaction to the reconstruction of the pavilion. OMA's project is, of course, an homage to the pavilion, but also to modern architecture, which was under attack in those very years. This is 85, right? As being, in his words, lifeless, empty, puritanical. It has always been our conviction that modern architecture is an hedonistic movement, that its abstraction, rigor, and severity are, in fact, plots to create the most provocative settings for the experiment that is modern life. End of the quote. But here, what interests me about is the way in which he frames it again. The framing of the project repeats Mies' polemical structure by giving equal value to image and to text, and again signing the text. It's a manifesto that echoes and transforms early manifestos. In the bodybuilding house, the Barcelona pavilion is, of course, inhabited by gymnasts, bodybuilders, and exercise equipment in a kind of a suprematist explosion of all kinds, right? The project alludes to here are some images. The project alludes, of course, to the tradition of, again, in this question of recycling other ideas, the tradition of the bodybuilding house in modern architecture, from Marcel Breuer's bedroom for Piscator in Berlin to the swimming pool of Villa Noël by Mallet Estebans in the south of France, to Richard Docker's gym in the roof of the Weissenhof in Stuttgart, and even to the transformation in the 1960s of Mies' Tugendhat house into a children's gym. But communist bureaucrats that probably have no idea that the project itself, in its initial, already have this idea. With you see these photographs of early pictures of the Tugendhat house with the naked children playing in the terrace, somehow uncannily echo in the photographs of the handicapped children exercising in the living room of the two-and-a-half house that has now been turned into a gym. OME takes modern architectural dream of a healthy body to a new level. Experimentation in exhibitions and publication always becomes collective. In the end, other architects pick up some of the idea, work on them, and then they are themselves responded to in different exhibitions. And this is actually what architectural discourse is all about, a kind of an exchange of manifestos. OMA positions itself here in relationship with its own time, the height of postmodernism and its attack on modern architecture through a twisting of myths, right? Through a twisting of myths that unleashes the repressed sensuality of modern architecture. A new manifesto then is produced by a twisting of an old one. The process continues. It may be a mark of how strong a manifesto is, how many times other people will go there, right? So, in the case of Sana, in 2008, they did an installation in the reconstructed now pavilion, the Barcelona pavilion. It is a classically Sana move of out-missing myths by inserting a transparent curtain into his pavilion. The place, of course, completely transformed by doing almost nothing. And as with myths, the architects are also famous for saying almost nothing. And yet, their description of the project that you can see here is a sophisticated repetition of myths manifesto technique. Once again, an image of the design is given equal status with the polemical points. In a sense, Sana goes one step forward by having the polemical statements actually spell out the steps of the design project. It's almost like a sub-talk, and isn't it what we are hearing a lot these days, that architects have stopped theorizing and producing manifestos, and just they tell us, they give us their sub-talks, they just tell us how they did it, I used this and I did that, and then value engineering came in and I took that out, and then the client came in, and then all my ideas were gone, and we are so profoundly bored. And I think this is why we are here, asking ourselves, where did the manifesto go? And I agree with this point of the sub-talk. I mean, in many ways, is what Jeffrey was saying before. But I want to argue something else here, which is, it may be, at least in the case of Sana, I will argue for this, that it's a new kind of manifesto, a kind of soft manifesto, refusing to define the future, yet organizing it into a series of points. So here are the points. Let me zoom on them so you can read them perhaps. We decided to use acrylic to make transparent curtains. We imagine an installation design that leaves the existing pavilion, space of the Barcelona pavilion undisturbed. The acrylic curtain stands freely on the floor and is shaped in a calm spiral. The curtain softly encompasses the space within the pavilion and creates a new atmosphere. The view through the acrylic will be something different from the original, with soft reflections slightly distorting the pavilion. Sana in the Barcelona pavilion is, of course, like the ultimate encounter, since Sana is widely considered the inheritor of Mission transparency. A challenge, as Sejima herself admitted, a return to the scene of the crime, one could argue. The installation carefully marks off a part of the pavilion with an acrylic curtain, which is acting like a kind of, I think, crime scene tape, leaving, as Sana put it, the space of the Barcelona pavilion undisturbed. But what crime has been committed here? What is being cordoned off? Is it the free-standing golden onyx wall at the center of the pavilion and the two Barcelona chairs? Or is the space outside the pavilion that has been marked off, preserved, kept undisturbed? In any case, the cordon is loose. The spiral is open. We can walk in, but not so easily. First, we will have to find the entrance. I don't have anything to point, but you can look, right? Slide around. Do you have a pointer, actually? No? Well, okay. You know what you have to do, right? You have to slide around. Squeeze yourself, right? And you have to do this and do an 80-degree change, which in a way echoes the 180 degrees that you are required to enter into the Barcelona pavilion. So slide around the outside of the current. And only when we are on the other side of the space of the pavilion, now divided by the curtain, we can suddenly fall back into the spiral, but making this 180-degree turn, which echoes the 180-degree turn already required to enter the Barcelona pavilion. Just as Mies narrowed the entrance down, subtly constraining the visitor with a folded path, Sana spins and squeezes the visitor between the narrow planes of acrylic that curve around until suddenly one is inside, facing the two Barcelona chairs, or rather they are facing us as if the king and queen were still there, sitting down, presiding over everything. But what do they mean the well, I don't need it anymore, sorry. I think we got that one. So, as if we were, or rather, as if the chairs were facing us, as if the king and queen of Spain were still there, sitting down, presiding over everything. But what do they mean that the pavilion is undisturbed? Something has changed. In fact, everything has changed. The simple spiral makes a new pavilion out of the old one, a pavilion inside a pavilion, each transforming the other to produce a whole new architecture. Sana, the diaphanous curtain, preserves the pavilion by allowing it to breathe. It is a kind of life support in a moment in which the subtlety of Mies might so easily be forgotten, precisely because the building is so intensely celebrated. The single curtain slows us down, allows us to enter the pavilion again, as if it was the day of the opening, the day of the inauguration. And once again, the fact that Mies did so little, when in fact he was asked so much, represent Germany in Barcelona, can be appreciated. Sana's vision is far from crystal clear. In fact, their architecture appears to be much more interested in a blurring of the views, in a softening of the focus than sustaining the transparency of the early avant-garde architecture. If Sejima is the inheritor of Miesian transparency, the latest in a long line of experiments, she is really the ultimate Miesian, deepening the logic of transparency into a whole new kind of mirage effect. The temporary acrylic curtain in Barcelona intensifies the Mies effect. A plastic lens is placed inside a glass lens to intensify and therefore prolong the Miesian effect. The ghost here, and definitely there is a ghost there. Maybe I do need that. Okay. There is a ghost there. This ghost is an ambiguously modern architecture, preserved rather than transformed by subtle deflections. Manifesto has gone from loud battle cry to almost silent preservation. The heroic image is preserved by an anti-heroic act, a new kind of manifesto. The arrival of this new kind of soft manifesto may be indeed the end game of the 20th century manifesto, the end game of the print and pavilion as the vehicle for the architectural manifesto. In an age in which electronic media is a primary site of debate and of exhibition, new forms of manifestos are surely emerging. Le Corbusier and Mies were fascinated by the latest media and used it as a true site of architectural production, and in so doing they brought architecture to the 20th century. In recent years, an unexpected revolution of at least the same significance of that experienced by people living in the early part of the 20th century has taken place. The internet, email, blogs, Google, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, WikiLeaks, etc. have profoundly changed the way we work, write, analyze, theorize, socialize, interact, play, even make love. Can we expect architecture to not to be affected? Once again, as with the early avant-garde manifesto, war is the context. I mean, many people have made this association already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Manifestos of the 20th century are, of course, inseparable from war. Here you have Sant'Elia, Boccioni, and Marinetti in the front in 1915. By 1916, two of them have already died. Marinetti in the front at war, and Boccioni doing some training for the war. Before moving down to the 21st century, century. Before the war stopped sometime last year, soldiers in Iraq had been uploading their videos on YouTube and WikiLeaks. So if World War II was the first media war and Vietnam was the first televised war, you can say that the war in Iraq is the first internet YouTube, and WikiLeaks wars. Journalists are no longer the first one in the scene or the most captivating. Think about this blogger called the Bathol Fuck the War. The first-hand account of the war in the blog of an American soldier posted in Mosul, Iraq in 2004. The blog lasted only a few weeks before the army forced him to close it. And also you could think about this young Iraqi woman who from 2003 to 2007, when her family moved in exasperation to Syria, reported on the day-to-day life in Iraq under the occupation in a blog called Riverbend. Baghdad Burning, this is her name, Riverbend, and the blog was called Baghdad Burning. In any case, what I'm trying to say is that this blog have told much more about this last war than any other form of traditional media. By the time the media gets there, it's too late anyway, and what the report is not that interesting. The audience is now the journalist, the critic, the artist. Soldiers in Iraq shoot and edit their own videos, add music to them. Riverbend blogs have been published in a book, as you can see here, which was translated into many languages and received many prizes. It has also been dramatized in several plays in a BBC series, as you can see on the right, called the Bathol published his blog in a book and became a writer for Esquire magazine. New media, in other words, occupies and transforms all media. The internet fits new kind of journalism. This has been accepted by all these fields. New kinds of literature, also studied in departments of literature. New forms of theater, new kinds of video. Can architecture be so far behind? While most architects are still using the techniques developed by Le Corbusier and others in the wake of World War I think a new generation of architects is experimenting with a new set of media. It is perhaps this reality that makes looking at the 20th century little magazines and manifestos current again. As McLuhan say, every new technology makes us aware of the old one. Thank you very much.
No, I mean, you don't want to fall asleep. You can join me 10 minutes. I guess I should thank everyone for still being here. I want to say that I truly believe I'm in the wrong place because I do not have an academic presentation, and that's why I'm not standing at the academic dais. I also think I'm here under false pretenses in the sense that I'm actually a collector of manifestos. I probably own one of the largest private collections of manifestos that exist in this country. Therefore, not as an architect or as a manifesto writer, but as a collector. All of the things that Beatriz showed, I have, except the sort of post-2000. So I was reminded that I'm supposed to speak about manifestos when I got an email from a former student of mine this week with just saying, my manifesto is almost ready. And I thought to myself, what could I possibly reply to this student? And I sent a 2-letter thing, and I just said, oh. Because I don't know what to do with manifestos today. In any case, what I want to do in a brief moment is to tell you about a little history that's never been written, which led to several manifestos that we have talked about today. And that is a meeting that occurred in 1964 before Venturi's book, before Rossi's book, before Gregotti's book, before Derrida's book, before Deleuze's book. In fact, before the idea of manifestos was really important in this country. There's a meeting that was held in Princeton, New Jersey in March of 1964 called the Case Group. I don't know if Ken's still here. Frampton was here. Ken was partly responsible for this. In fact, he was flown to America for this meeting. It's the first time he'd ever been out of Europe, to be the editor of a new magazine. The group had no name, but it was a group of young architects that were brought together. Michael Graves, Richard Meyer, Bob Venturi, myself, and others, but who were to be supposedly led by two of the leading American theoreticians, on the one hand, Vince Scully, and on the other hand, Colin Rowe. Both of them came to this meeting thinking that they were going to lead a unified and polemical group, not realizing that half of the people were not much interested in Colin Rowe and the other certainly not much interested in Vincent Scully. It became apparent after the first day of meetings that there was something very much amiss in this situation. And it was really stunning in the morning of the second day when Bob Venturi and Vince Scully announced that they were leaving this meeting because this was not the kinds of people and the kinds of ideas that they wanted to deal with. In fact, that leaving, in fact, was the beginning of the split in American architecture at the time that started in 1964 between the then now known as the whites and the grays. And it was the whites who remained under, as it were, the putative leadership of Colin Rowe. Whether that triggered Bob Venturi 2 years later to write his book, Complexity and Contradiction, one cannot say. I do know that after Venturi and Scully left, Ken Frampton was appointed an editor of a magazine called the Case Magazine, Conference of Architects for the Study of the Environment, and this was in '64. I guess a number of years went by to '66 when Bob Venturi's book came out and Aldo Rossi's, and still there was no magazine. Another meeting was held by the same group of people in 1966 in Buffalo, New York, and it was decided to call this other magazine Reform, Form. Again, many names for magazines, many ideas for who would write in these magazines, but again, by '66, there was no magazine. The reaction to Bob Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction was very heated. There had not been a polemical debate in the United States that was public, but certainly that debate in '66 was crystallized by the appearance of his book. Not only was that debate crystallized, but also the student riots and the general unrest that occurred in '68 prompted enormous shifts in the sensibilities of those people concerned with architecture, the city, etc. So much so that I remember in '68, Michael Graves and I, who had been teaching at Princeton, went to MIT to give a lecture and were actually booed off the stage by the students and were not allowed to give the lecture. Things were, in a sense, very heated in those days. There were debates over the Venturi position, certainly among the people who would become the 5 architects. And it was out of a reaction to the Venturi book that a series of meetings, again, case meetings, case 7 and case 8, were held at the Museum of Modern Art, and 5 architects who had nothing to do with one another but presented work in front of Ken Frampton and Colin Rowe and Jim Sterling and Joseph Rickwert and others, debating among themselves. And the 5 Architects book was not intended to be a public display of a group of like-minded architects, but just something that was to be a reaction to the Venturi book. In fact, the first edition of 5 Architects, which was published, was 500 copies, of which they are now very rare and certainly collector's items. I certainly think that many of us would like to have one of those first editions. But in any case, the important thing was that out of the case group came another discourse, which was Oppositions magazine. And Oppositions was, to begin with, formed by Kenneth Frampton, Tony Vidler, and myself as in one sense, a reaction to both the 5 Architects and to the Venturi book. And it's important to realize that the first cover of Oppositions was actually 0 positions. In other words, it was not so much an opposition to either Venturi or the 5 Architects, but the fact that it was impossible in the year 1972 or 73 to have a single opposition, and perhaps no positions were the only possible opposition. And in that sense, no positions to me represent something that I would call an anti-manifesto. And it was that moment in time, again, a moment of recession, which I think, as was '82, as was 2008, moments in time when there could not be a manifesto. There could only be a situation that declared itself the impossibility of holding a position, which in itself, as we know, is a position. One of the things I wanted to say to Jeffrey Schnapp in conclusion before we Schnapp join our discussion was that if in fact there was a crisis, which you seem to suggest, then I think there would be a manifesto. The fact that I don't think there is a crisis leads me to think that there is no manifesto. And that's why I replied to my student, oh. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll just float one of the two questions, whichever, and down, just to kind of get some people talking to each other here. I was struck in terms of both Jeffrey and Beatriz's presentation about how both of you pointed to manifestos operating in space, right? So these kind of things that were actually located, the built project, and Jeffrey, your analysis, those wonderful kind of diagrams that you were able to show, concluded with Jenks, what you saw as a kind of disaggregation, right, of architecture from space. And this, for you, was a kind of question about whether that would contribute to the absence of the manifesto in a way. And Beatriz, in a very different way, you kept talking about very concrete spatial things, right? How in fact, with the example of the Sanaa Pavilion, you get this sort of blurred space that was for you a kind of soft manifesto, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm interested if both of you could speak in a sense to whether, Beatriz, you see that soft manifesto appearing elsewhere, if it's in fact something more general than just in Sanaa. And Jeffrey, if you see in a sense, if you could say a bit more about spaces today where you would see the possibility of a manifesto emerging. Obviously a space that is partly mediated and partly public, right?
Do you want to start, Beatriz?
Whatever you prefer. I mean, okay, I mean, you know, of course, I mean, we have this in common to have pointed out this question of the manifesto as public space itself is the space of making public. I mean, in societies that are highly illiterate or before even the existence of the print, public space is the space where things are made manifest, they are made public. The manifesto of the late 19th century and 20th century, of course, is the transformation already of this public space, which is very interesting because the architects are not just the architects that I'm interested in, which are basically the ones that use that space. Yeah, and I must be said that it's the majority of architects of the 20th century. I mean, it's very, very hard to come up with a name of an architect that we are interested in the 20th century that did not occupy this space of writing. Everything is manifestos and writing from the beginning of the century, from Adolf Loos and Frank Lloyd Wright to the very end of the century with people like Peter Eisenman or Koolhaas or Bernard, etc., is a century in which and in the middle anybody you can think about, you immediately think about a book, you immediately think about a text, and I pointed precisely to the case of Mies because we don't think on Mies in those terms, but even Mies you cannot understand. So those architects understood space has changed. That's why they are occupying this space to make their statements and use it to produce their own projects. The second turn is that there is a new idea of space, of course, which is materialized, that is in the projects. Therefore, for an architect, the project itself is part of the manifesto. There is a new conception of the space that goes with this question with this new space in which we are operating. Likewise, if you were asking me about where it will be today, this is the last part of the presentation. I think probably they don't look like manifestos anymore, and they are not produced in print anymore because that's not, again, the main public space that we are occupying. The printed media, I mean, if you think about what architectural magazines are doing for us today, by the time an architectural magazine comes out, we already know everything. So, I mean, they have a task, as far as I'm concerned, they have the task to reinvent themselves. It's not that they are obsolete, of course. They will, you know, each new media redefines the old media. I'm very curious to see how magazines will reinvent themselves, but they haven't done quite it yet in a very intelligent way, as far as I'm concerned, right? And in the meantime, there is this new space of public exchange, which is where I will expect to find the equivalent of the manifesto today.
I'm just going to piggyback on what Beatriz just said. I think physical architectures have always been information architectures. I mean, there's a very close coupling between the two, and the history of the manifesto that has been part of our conversation today is one that begins in the public squares of towns and cities in the form of posters, broadsides, other forms of public communication, whether for or against a state. They shift to media already by the time we get to the end of the 19th century. Futurism is a exemplary symptomatic case where it's, in a sense, the information architecture of the newspaper that models, in a sense, this emerging sense of a public space where you might say that the newspaper is the beginning of a kind of public facade of all kinds of institutions, that they need to be present on that square. And I think now we're in a kind of radicalized version of that, where the true facade of every public building, in a sense, is of course its presence on the web in the first instance, and its physical structure is a kind of secondary instance of that external presence. So the question of what the nature of a public space that has that characteristic, and it's a set of material characteristics that I didn't really go into in any fine-grained detail, but I think the basic boundary lines between forms of privacy and publicity are up for grabs in a way in public life right now, in some novel and provocative and even troubling ways, you might say. I mean, you walk around the streets of a city, you are in the kinds of public spaces of reference, and most people are in communities that are not physically present in those spaces. They're networked, engaged in other, sets of links that are not mapped into that physical space. So what kind of public realm is that for the performance of a genre that's so much based, like where the normative situation is so much associated with a very clearly definable theater of communications, if you like. I mean, each moment in the history of the manifesto has involved the reinvention of that active performance, I think. And I guess my answer would be that I do think that in digital culture, the manifesto has been having a kind of thriving present, but it suffers from exactly the same challenge that architectural manifestos have been suffering from. So in a sense, they're maybe just a particularly symptomatic exemplification of the crisis of a certain form of public communication, it seems to me, or public polemic or argumentation, in the sense that they are extraordinarily prolific, but they speak in very small, maybe even increasingly small worlds, unless there is a kind of broad social economic crisis, in which case the conditions shift, and in a sense we return to an earlier context of performance. So this coupling between the kind of the media history of space and genres of polemic that want to reshape those spaces is, I think it's not something we invented in our era. We just experience it in a particular set of crisscrossing capabilities, possibilities, and limits.
Peter, you mentioned how you felt in the early 70s when you started oppositions that it was kind of an anti-manifesto, right? That it was actually impossible to take a position. But at the same moment, that was also a period of severe economic and political crisis like we see today. So do you see this kind of impossibility of taking a position actually being an option today, of taking a kind of position? Is there a sort of analogous?
Well,
or is it?
I came here thinking that and not being nostalgic for the 60s and 70s, but I don't believe that you could motivate a group of students to take over a building, to burn an architectural school down, to do the kinds of things they did at Columbia and Yale, in any way, shape, or form today, other than to institute a draft. I do not believe either the students or our teachers or our institutions, because we're certainly not in the profession. But I see no movement. I see satire, I see irony, I see, whatever that magazine is, at Princeton Widget or whatever. Pigeon, yeah. Is certainly not, or the magazine that comes out of Yale, or the one that comes out of Harvard, or the one that comes out of Columbia. They're certainly not manifesto-type publications, nor are the students the types. What do they want? They want jobs. They want to get into the system like everybody else. What do they want to learn? They want to learn Revit. You know, I mean, I say to myself, why should we teach Revit in the School of Architecture? Certainly Revit is not going to promote an architectural manifesto in no way, shape, or form. So I think we're looking at, we are responsible for these people, by the way. But I'm always reminded of Colin Rowe imitating H.L. Mencken's cartoon of Walt Whitman trying to get the American eagle to fly. And Walt Whitman is waving his arms like this, and the American eagle is looking like that. And I often get the sense when I'm in front of a class of students, I feel a bit like Walt Whitman, and to me they look like the American eagle. So they're saying, what the hell is he getting upset about? So no, I don't think we're in anywhere near a moment where we could motivate, because this is where it's going to come from, this group of people to get up and do anything like that.
I mean,
Maybe they want to reply to that.
yeah, does anybody?
That was a provocation.
That is a provocation. We have a.
It's interesting that this turned toward a discussion of public space and media occupation and sort of that term, given the events particularly of yesterday, when a group of students came out of this school and various other buildings on this campus and went downtown, participated in a very large rally in Union Square, followed up with an even larger and kind of shocking march through the streets of Manhattan, through the thoroughfares, down 6th Avenue, between cars, into Foley Square, where upwards of 10,000 people were gathered, including students from schools all across the city. I question whether that moment isn't happening right now, and whether or not the kind of presentations that are occurring in the media, through Twitter, through all these various means. We had an SMS group that was communicating throughout the whole situation, and the night culminated in massive projections on the Verizon building, that brutalist facade, using curt little hashtag type phrases that were being broadcast to all the people on the bridge who again had taken, you know, a completely radical turn onto the roadway of the Brooklyn Bridge. And we're not, you know, there was a danger, there was a line where their play, their sort of exuberance was confronting the police line, but it operated, you know, through that. There was a neutrality that was kind of being achieved that I think has to do with these media presentations and has to do with the response. So I think there might be a shift occurring. I wonder.
No, I think it remains to be seen how much energy, I mean, because 68 really did spark and move and collect a lot. And whether this will, in fact, engender that, we should see. I wouldn't say, no, I mean, in my experience so far, far removed from these halls, I don't see my students marching around, but I could be wrong.
If I could just comment, though, I think that I really appreciate your responding on this point. And I guess what I would argue is that these kinds of the Occupy demonstrations, like many of their immediate predecessors over the course of the last decade or two, they repeat certain patterns of protest and political action that have deep roots in the history of the modern era. But I think the existence of these media networks, communications networks, really has profoundly reshaped the way those events happen and who the participants are. So, and that does come back to Craig's important question about where are the niches and spaces where there's emerging forms, publics, places of performance, of critical discourse, you might say. Right. And they are increasingly in places that have this hybrid physical digital identity. And that creates a problem. It's a problem for architecture that has traditionally been the art that has shaped those public places. It's a problem for society because those are not places where the rules of visibility and recognition and aggregation and assembly that had characterized the sort of era of popular sovereignty are the defining attributes. So we're in a kind of new, much more uncertain game where most of the participants in that demonstration were not assembled physically. They were assembled in some other sense. Yeah.
But I think I want to push on that a little bit. In particular in regard to the way that some of the Occupy movement might be, say, rehearsing some of the kind of organizational patterns of the 20th century. In particular to what I think is one of the most amazing, say, theorizations of the newspaper of the 20th century, namely Lenin's 1901, Where to Begin, where he likens the newspaper to a construction site, quite literally. And I introduced this as a way to ask how this discussion of manifestos and the role of the newspaper might also be tied to counterpublics. Because we have to remember that Lenin, as he's writing this in 1901, is working underground. And there's an underground network of communications that are trying to organize to seize public space. So I want to push to try and insert some of these kinds of strategies into the discussion.
Well, I think certainly, I mean, one of the things that seems, we keep coming back to the Occupy movement, but one of the things that is interesting is all of these events happened yesterday were planned within the last 2 weeks. In fact, their targets were quite shifting, right? So the Occupy movements on Wall Street were planned 2 weeks ago. The rally that was at Union Square yesterday was planned within a couple of days, and using these types of media to locate a spot and to move it. And then for the people, as they streamed out, we streamed out into several avenues and completely dispersed, and then reunited again at Foley Square, because that had been another site added a few days earlier. So in fact, this is an ecology between the shorter time frame of the planning and the way that locates specific spaces in the city, right? None of which would have been possible with print, for instance. This is definitely...
Let me ask you a question, and I throw this out. Do you think these rallies, movements, the Occupy Wall Street will help in the next election? I mean, in other words, will they galvanize an electorate which seems apathetic that helped to elect Obama through these same electronic media? Will their apathy, which is still registered in polls, come to the polls in a year from now, and will they be effective? That's what would proof the pudding to me, whether they can rally this group of people to act in a what, Jeffrey, you're smiling.
Well, I think that assumes that the measure of political success is electoral, and I think
that's certainly one of the things.
Oh no, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I also think that there's a lot of different manifestations of how these kinds of changes happen, and the. I mean, I think there's some very interesting, Craig just alluded to one of the interesting, like marching as a form of symbolic seizing of the cityscape, for instance, is typically between symbolically marked places, so public, and you were just describing precisely an action that has this different characteristic, that isn't completely built around like marching to the Bastille or, you know, occupying the mall. That does suggest that we're operating in a different framework in terms of the meaning of events and the way that their act, you know, the relationship between physically assembled participants and these broader communities of participants that are off-site, that are telepresent.
Exactly the same thing in the Arab Spring. So in many ways, it was super interesting to follow this also from the point of view of architecture. It was almost like these hybrid spaces that you say we're operating with the media and with, which is exactly how we are operating also in everyday life, all of us, right? You're in the street, but you're on the phone with someone, and then in the meantime, you know, you are connecting with, so you are, how many people are in the street that are actually in that space? They are connecting to so many other physical space, even emotionally, they are crying and they're on the phone with someone that maybe is across the Atlantic, right? So we are occupying simultaneously all these spaces. The Arab Spring is, I like to call it the revenge of architecture, you know, in the sense that all of a sudden physical space became so relevant again for all of us, just in the very moment that we were saying that this could not have been organized without all these new kind of media. At the same time, they are in the physical space, and without that presence, nothing will happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a very interesting moment. And Occupy Wall Street has the same characteristic.
Very much.
Jose over there is making fire signs.
Jose, and then there was one over here as well.
It was the Occupy.
He's giving you the...
You were
the-
getting hysterical.
Right.
There's somebody over here.
There's a question here, yeah.
Well, they're going to get you a microphone.
Thank you. This question is kind of picking up some of the comments that's been discussed, but it's for Jeffrey, but open to the rest of the panel, and particularly pertaining to, specifically that little blue bird that's probably was on 85% of your slides. It's been discussed that if the old forms of manifesto is print, and the new forms of media with the dissemination of information has made that kind of information much more ubiquitous, instantaneous, and ever-changing. On the other hand, I think this is a hinge, is that there's a kind of renewed either fear or suspicion or kind of outright rejection of ideology, which is synonymous with manifestos. And we saw, in Mubarak, in Gaddafi, and certainly with Occupy Wall Street, definitely, maybe not what it is now, but definitely what it started out as, and definitely more so in Europe, that it was a rejection of ideology through action, all of which was enabled by social media. And I think, very simply, if manifestos is, very reductively a form of like marketing or PR, that certainly has transformed from publication to a matter of communication. And I'm wondering, you're talking about the rules and how those rules haven't yet been written, but I question whether it has, and whether those rules are now the 140 characters that takes what it is to make a tweet. And whether that is the syntax, and the author is, the analytic system that describes or composites all of those tweets into a trend, and that trend then is sort of the new kind of manifesto. And I think, I think what's kind of what's interesting, and I think my provocation is, in that diagram that you show where the manifesto is dead. Well, maybe in fact it's not dead, but it's very much alive in the kind of analytics that, or even the representation of that diagram.
Yeah, I really appreciate that provocation, and I think the point you're making is very well founded. That we're in a world where some of those rules are being put into place, and they certainly shape models of communication and models of action for and against, if you like. The larger point I was trying to make, however, just to clarify, is advertising, the manifesto as we understand it classically. These were languages that were not meant to be personalized. They were meant to be generalizable languages. And we've now moved into a realm where advertising is for you. It's not for you as a collective subject, but it's for you. And this applies to so many different features of the communication landscape that we're in, that creates this much more iterative, adaptive set of processes. And that does raise the question of the basic political models that have shaped the society that we live in, for better or for worse, that are associated with notions like popular sovereignty, kind of the citizen as a kind of universal subject. I think that's the tension that we're talking about here, and I think your provocation really intersects with it really quite directly. So I think it's not as if the rules are not written. I take that as a correction. I think that rather they're in a sort of fluid state, I think. But the degree to which those different rules of like writing a statement for an ideology or against an ideology, engaging in critique, to which those can become communicable. In other words, they can become socially meaningful, not just messages in a bottle that go off and drift off in a vast sea of information. I mean, I think that's the really interesting challenge where the digital and the physical meet.
Tony's got a question.
No, it's just a comment on the just looking at occupation is not enough. We have to look at, I think, the sites of occupation. I think it was one of the most profound ironies, I thought, which made a big point, was the taking of the bridges, and especially the taking of the Boston Bridge, which couldn't be taken because otherwise it would buckle, and that taking was on the same day that the Congress voted down the infrastructure bill. And I thought that this was one of the most powerful symbolic movements, right, or blocking of movements, because you can't get on the bridge because it's going to fall down, and now we've just blocked rebuilding that bridge.
Right. That's another question here. No.
She passed. Hey.
Question got truncated.
I'm wondering if you all think that there might be any correlation between this concern over the death of the manifesto and the lack of, like, basically my generation's emphasis on pragmatic issues over revolution and contemporary architecture, where there's pockets of an emphasis on design driven by program and driven by these pragmatic issues, and firms like Big, where they have these diagrams of how programmatic considerations are determining their design. So is there a correlation between these architects who are more interested in program than in some other more abstract forms of theory and the loss of the manifesto and political involvement?
I mean, it's obvious, right? I mean, this is what we have been discussing. I mean, this is the frustration, I suppose, that we all feel today. And it's not just your generation, it's also a whole generation of architects that are not that young anymore, and they stopped a long time ago. Some people call it the soft talk generation. They even describe themselves as the soft talk the generation, the ones that come and tell you, that would have been unthinkable even in the 90s. I think in one of the Ennies you guys organized at the Guggenheim, I don't know who it was, maybe it was Jack or Nouvel or someone goes and shows the project.
Yeah.
And Ren got furious. I mean, who can do this in our times? No, nobody thought that you could simply come and say, "I'm next," and then I did this, and then I did that. And now you have another version of that show and tell lecture in the I did this, and then the client did that, and the client took that, and then the value engineering, and and you go like, okay, I'm sure, but I mean, do we need this? So this is a problem. Where is discussion happening? It's another interesting issue. This week, Scott was at Princeton, and he gave a lecture, and then in the dinner we were talking about this, about how nobody dares to say anything anymore. This is very a subject that is very dear to Peter. Even he himself censored himself at a certain point in the lectures. He said, "Oh no, I cannot say that because of course we are self-censoring ourselves because of we are being recorded and then goes in the internet, so there are certain things we cannot say and certain questions that you cannot ask." And then at the dinner he said, where the real conversation is taking place? And he shows me a thread of tweet where he's having this. So the most interesting stuff now is being exchanged, as Jeffrey, I think, was saying before, privately through, I suppose it corresponds to the time of the letter, the letters of another period where the most interesting stuff sometimes was being said in letters, right? The letters of Freud to Fleiss, or in the letter you feel in a space in which you are communicating with a smaller group that and that you allow yourself to say certain things that are acceptable. So it's very possible that the most radical thinking in architecture now is indeed this space. So it's not taking anymore the form of the mass audience, in the same way that in our culture we are not operating that way anymore, right? And what we will make of it eventually, I'm not so sure, but the future is the the great idea of the manifesto is to do it in the figure of, to reach precisely a mass audience, right? They waited, as Jeffrey said, 4 years, but not in any newspaper. It has to be one that will be read all over Europe, right? I don't think that ambition is felt by many architects today, because we know already that we are, already Le Corbusier knew that you are targeting a particular audience, right? Modern advertising is that.
Okay.
Yes?
So I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. I will thank the panel, and we're going to take a brief 5-minute break for coffee and getting our energies back, and we will meet back here. Okay, thank you.
Good to see you, Peter.
Nice to see
It's
you.
been too long?
Yes.
You're gonna stay around.